So in the book of Daniel, as we continue on in our finding our place in God's story, it's so cool to have people like Patrick who are trying to find his place in God's story and learn about God's story and how God's story and his own story intersect. And we're all doing that. And as we've been reading through the Bible, on Sundays, we've been going through various sort of like sections of the Bible. And the first 6 months, which we're actually rounding out today, this is, can you believe that? This is sort of our 6-month halfway mark of the year. Where has 2020 gone? So we went through the Old Testament in the first 6 months, and in the second 6 months, we're going to spend our time in the New Testament. So obviously we haven't divided it up equally, since the New Testament is only about a quarter of the Bible. We're still going to spend about half of our time on it. So the first 6 months, we've gone through the Old Testament, and we broke it up into 3 sections. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. In particular, on Sundays, we spoke mostly about Genesis. And then we spent time in the prophets, and now we're spending time in the writings, which is the traditional Hebrew sectioning of the Old Testament, known as the Tanakh, the Torah, the Ketuvim, and the Nevi'im, the writings, the prophets, and the Torah. And so today, we're going to finish out our time in the writings, and we're going to kind of just high-level skim over and touch a point in the writing of Daniel. Daniel is in the classification of the writings of the Ketuvim in the Hebrew organization of the scriptures. But it has various literary genres in it. For those of you that know, Daniel also possesses apocalyptic literature in it, as well as narrative literature. So we're going to kind of do a high-level overview, and then I just want to make just basically a single point of commentary as I believe Daniel relates to us still to this day. So the book of Daniel, I'm assuming that some of you have read the book of Daniel, some of you have not. If you have not read Daniel, this will be new and maybe helpful, and if you have, maybe it'll be a refresher. But there's basically 2 main parts in the book of Daniel. The first 6 chapters presents accounts of Daniel and his 3 friends in this foreign court. And then in chapters 7 through 12, it contains 4 apocalyptic visions. Each account and each vision expresses the same important message, that in spite of circumstances that make it appear as though evil is winning the day, God is actually the one who is in control, and he will have the final victory. This is the consistent message through all 4 of those visions. And so we're going to take a minute here to watch the Bible Project video on the book of Daniel. I think these videos are very helpful to give us an overview and help orient us to some of this literature that can seem very foreign and very strange, especially as we get into apocalyptic literature. We're going to jump into more of that later this year as we dive into the book of Revelation.
The book of Daniel. The story is set right after Babylon's first attack on Jerusalem, and they had plundered the city and its temple and taken a wave of Israelites into exile. Among them were 4 men from the royal family of David: Daniel, who's later named Belteshazzar, and his 3 friends who you probably know by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This book tells of their struggles to maintain hope in the land of their conquerors. The book's design seems pretty simple at first. Chapters 1 through 6 contain stories about Daniel and his friends in Babylon, while chapters 7 through 12 contain the visions of Daniel about the future. But this 2-part shape is made even more interesting by another design feature, and that's the book's language. It begins in Hebrew, the language of the Israelites, but chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic, a cousin language to Hebrew spoken widely among the ancient empires. But then in chapters 8 through 12, it goes back to Hebrew. This design shows how chapters 2 through 7 are a coherent section, but it also highlights the importance of chapters 2 and 7 for understanding the later chapters of the book. Let's just dive in. Chapter 1 introduces the basic tension of the first half of the book. Daniel and his friends, they're really wise and capable, and they're recruited to serve in the royal palace of Babylon. But they're pressured to give up their Jewish identity by living and eating like Babylonians and violating the Jewish food laws found in the Torah. So they refuse, and they choose faithfulness to the Torah, and it puts them in danger. But God delivers them, and they end up being elevated by the king of Babylon. After this begins the Aramaic section, which you'll see has this really cool symmetrical design. So first, the king of Babylon has a dream that, it turns out, only Daniel is able to interpret. It's about a huge statue made of 4 types of metal, and it symbolizes a sequence of kingdoms, and the head is Babylon. But then a huge rock comes flying in, and it shatters the statue, and it becomes this huge mountain. Now, this dream is the first of many symbolic visions in the book, and this one introduces the basic storyline of them all. Daniel says that the statue represents a train of human kingdoms following from Babylon, and they will all fill God's world with violence. But one day, God's kingdom will come and will confront and humble the arrogant kingdoms of this world and fill the world with the healing justice of God's reign and rule. After this, chapter 3 tells the famous story of Daniel's 3 friends who refuse to bow down and worship a huge idol statue, which, like the statue in chapter 2, represents the king and his imperial power. And so the friends are persecuted. They're thrown into a fiery furnace, but God delivers them from death, and they're exalted by the king, who now acknowledges their God as the true one. After this come a pair of stories about 2 Babylonian kings, the father, Nebuchadnezzar, and then his son, Belshazzar. They're both filled with pride because of their imperial power. And so, like in chapter 2, God warns them both through dreams and then visions, which, also like chapter 2, only Daniel can interpret. He says that both kings are to humble themselves before God, and both kings arrogantly resist. So Nebuchadnezzar is stricken with madness. He becomes like a beast in the field. But then he humbles himself before God, and his humanity returns to him. He's restored as king. This is in contrast with his son, Belshazzar, who doesn't humble himself before God, and he's assassinated that very night. Now, these 2 stories draw this imagery from Genesis chapters 1 and 2 and Psalm 8, where humans are depicted as the royal image of God. He's given them authority to rule over the beasts of the field and the birds of the air on behalf of God, who is the world's true king. But when human kingdoms forget that, when they rebel and make themselves and their power into a God, they become less than human, like violent beasts who will face God's justice. Which brings us to chapter 6, the pair of chapter 3. And this time it's Daniel who's being persecuted because he refuses to pray and worship the king as a god. And so, like the friends, he's sentenced to death and he's thrown into a lion's den. But God delivers him from the beasts, and like the friends, the king exalts Daniel and praises his God, which brings us to chapter 7. It's the pair of chapter 2 and the center of the book where all its themes come together. It's another dream, but it's Daniel's this time. And ironically, he can't understand the dream until an angelic messenger explains it to him. He sees a series of 4 beasts, one like a lion, then like a bear, then one like a winged leopard, each of these symbolizing an arrogant kingdom. And last of all is a super beast, identified as a really evil empire. And it has lots of horns, a common symbol for kings in the Old Testament. And there's one specific horn who is an image of an arrogant king who exalts himself above God and persecutes God's people. Now they are symbolized by a figure called the Son of Man, who's an image for both God's covenant people, but also for their king from the line of David. But then all of a sudden, God, who's called the Ancient of Days, comes and he sets up his throne. He destroys the super beast and he exalts the Son of Man on the clouds, where he comes up to sit at God's right hand and share in God's rule over the nations. We can look back now and see how all of these stories in the first half fit together. The 3 stories of faithfulness despite persecution, these are meant to offer hope to God's suffering people among the nations. But they suffer because human kingdoms have rebelled against God and have become beasts. And so these visions encourage patience, that God's people are to wait for him to bring his kingdom and rule over our world and vindicate his suffering people. But it raises the question about when God is going to do that, and that's what these final 3 visions set out to explore. In chapter 8, Daniel has another vision about the final two beasts of chapter 7, but this time they're symbolized by a ram, who we're told is an image of the empire of the Medes and Persians, and then by a goat, who's an image of ancient Greece. And out of the goat come a whole bunch of horns, one of which symbolizes the evil king from chapter 7. And we're told more about him, that he will attack Jerusalem and exalt himself above God and defile the temple with idols. However, in the end, he will be destroyed by God, who will exalt his people and his kingdom. Now, by chapter 9, Daniel is very puzzled, especially as to when all of this is going to take place. And so he consults the scroll of the prophet Jeremiah, where God said that Israel's exile would only last 70 years. So for Daniel, the 70 years is almost up. And so he asks God to fulfill his promise soon. But an angel comes and informs him that Israel's sin and rebellion has continued. And so their time of exile and oppression will continue on 7 times longer than Jeremiah envisioned. Daniel is deeply disturbed by this, and he has one final vision. We're shown the same sequence of kingdoms. It's Persia, then Greece, and Alexander the Great, followed by lesser kings, all leading up to this final king of the north, who will invade Jerusalem, set up idols in the temple, and exalt himself above God. But then, all of a sudden, this king comes to ruin. Now, there's been endless debate about what all of these visions refer to. Many see a clear connection to the exploits of the Syrian king Antiochus in the 160s BC. He killed many faithful Jews in Jerusalem and set up idols in the temple. Others think it points forward to the Roman Empire's role in the execution of Jesus and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. And still others think it will be fulfilled in future events that have yet to happen when Jesus will return. Now the problem is that the symbols and the numbers, they don't quite match any of these views perfectly. But it opens up the possibility that in a sense they are all right. The book of Daniel has been designed to offer hope to all future generations of God's people. It did so in the days of Antiochus's empire, and it has ever since. This is why Jesus could use imagery from Daniel to describe and confront the oppressive leaders he confronted in Jerusalem. This is why John, the visionary who wrote the Revelation, could adapt Daniel's visions and apply them to Rome of his day and also all future oppressive empires. And so the point of Daniel is that all generations of readers can find here a pattern and a promise. It's a pattern that human beings and their kingdoms become violent beasts when they glorify their own power, when they redefine right and wrong and don't acknowledge God as their true king. But Daniel also holds out a promise that one day God will confront the beast. He will rescue his world and his people by bringing his kingdom over all nations. And so for every generation, this book speaks a message of hope that should motivate faithfulness. And that's what the book of Daniel is all about.
Okay, so the book of Daniel is a part of the writings collection in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew organization. And I wanted to touch down on Daniel a little bit today because I think that in the midst of our context, I think that there are some things that we still need to really pay attention to in this very ancient book. So this book of Daniel was written to encourage those living during times of oppression and persecution in exile. And so its stories and its vision show that it's possible not only to survive, but to thrive as a faithful follower of God, even under the most difficult of conditions. And so while we don't face necessarily the same severe persecutions that the people in this book do, like Daniel and his friends, we do live in a culture that can be toxic and hostile to our faith. Toxicity like relativism and universalism and liberalism, and now front and center racism. And while we are not to blindly bury our heads in the sand or to not be active and engaged in loving others and bringing God's justice to the world around us, the book of Daniel can help, though, to remind us that God is in control and he will win the final victory. And so it can provide confidence for us for living in our present context, even when it's desperate, even when it's difficult, even when it looks bleak and that evil is winning. It gives us hope to face our future. If you will, look over in Daniel chapter 3. This is probably one of the more, if not most famous stories out of the book of Daniel, something that probably will be familiar to many of us. In Daniel chapter 3 and verse 8, at this time some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, may the king live forever. Your majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold. And that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. You noticing a theme here? Throughout all of human history, there's always going to be some group of people going to the group of people in power saying, that group over there is not giving you the honor that you deserve. Yeah, sounds very familiar, doesn't it? Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. What happens when rulers don't get the worship that they think they deserve? Well, rage starts coming out. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Look, these aren't three random guys. These aren't three dudes just off the streets. These are like from his court. These are his boys. These are his employees. These are the guys that are supposed to be representing. And he says, wait, is this true? That you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Apparently, they didn't do enough vetting in HR during the hiring of these three guys. Now, when you hear the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image that I have made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? I read this and I just hear this. It's like a showdown at high noon. Here it comes, you know. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they replied to him. They pulled out their pistols. They said, all right, you ready? King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. They go, brow, brow, brow. And then what do they do with their guns? They put them back in their holsters. And they say, you know what? We're not afraid. Then Nebuchadnezzar, what did he do? He was furious. He got out bigger guns. And he said, he was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. He said, all right, nuke button. You're getting the full onslaught, the full measure that I have. It's going to be made 7 times hotter than usual. And he commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They didn't even get out of the way of the mushroom cloud. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. The book of Daniel, and this story here in particular, can be a model for us on how God's people should live in this world when it is torn by evil forces. It says Nebuchadnezzar's attitude towards them changed. He got even more upset, even more PO'd, even more enraged. And I believe that this can help us know, how are we to live when it seems like the forces of evil are so enraged? Because we know that God's victory is assured and that his kingdom will prevail. And so we should take courage and confidence and hope, just like Daniel and his 3 friends did. While God's people can survive and even prosper in a toxic culture, we should be ready to face death, knowing that even death is not beyond God's rescue. And for those of you that are familiar, you know that the story goes on. God rescues Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel. That God is honored and worshiped even by Nebuchadnezzar because of the great power and might that is displayed in rescuing his servants. But I love the attitude of Daniel's friends here. It says in verse 18, but even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, they have deference, they give respect, they use the title that the king deserves, your majesty, but we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. And that one line, that one sentence, that one phrase, there's so much that we can learn. That they were not disrespectful. They weren't jumping on Twitter and Facebook and saying how much the evil empire sucked, how much the evil emperor of the United States is terrible or whatever. They didn't do that. They said, you know what, your majesty? Even if God doesn't save us, even if we die, even if we pay with our lives, we're going to respect you, but we are going to draw a line in the sand and say we will not worship anyone but the one true God, even if it costs us our lives. And I'm concerned that for some of us, we've lost sight of this kind of faith, that we're no longer willing to courageously face death, much less jeering on social media, for the sake of our faith in a God who delivers from death itself, who raises the dead. But instead, we call ourselves disciples of Jesus while trying to cling on to with all of our might to our civil liberties and our comfortable modern Western lifestyles and our individualistic understandings of rights and freedom. We cling on to these things and we forget about our faith and having courage in a God who raises the dead and can deliver us from evil. And of course, none of these things are wrong in and of themselves. Our civil liberties, our modern comforts, the ability that I have to transmit to you right now in 1080p HD, none of these things are inherently evil. They're not wrong in themselves, but we've got to be careful that we do not make out of them idols of gold and bow down to them. We are not being asked, as these men were, to bow down to an image of gold that the king made, but we are being asked to give our worship and to worship things that are not God. And many times we are being asked, solicited, and pushed towards worship of things that we don't even recognize we're worshiping.